Yeah, I'll start by saying welcome back to everyone, and also welcome to the new faces that sit in here, which are a few ones. And I'll not make a big introduction of what this is, but it's a cooperation project between 6 schools of architecture studying the 21st seminar Urban Form, the second seminar Planning for Inclusion. Very short introduction, but welcome to that one, and then I'll introduce the next speakers. Eliseu Gonçalves, who is architect who graduated in 1994 from the Faculty of Architecture of the University of Porto. And since 1999 has been a professor at FAUP in the scientific area of construction technology. And Raquel Paulino, who is an architect, graduated in 1998, master in planning and project of the urban environment, and a PhD in architecture also from FAUP. She has worked as a professional collaborator for Alvaro Cis and Antonio Madureira between September 98 and July 2004. She's assistant professor at the Faculty of Architecture of the University of Porto and a researcher at the Center for Architecture and Urbanism Studies. I'll keep them brief in that way and hand over to you as quickly as possible, but welcome and please go ahead, and I'll hand the mic to you.
Okay. Thank you, Daniel. Good afternoon. I read a text. Sorry for that. It's more simple to control the time. I will. Good afternoon. You want to thank the organization for the invitation, especially Professor Leandro, and also Eric. It's an honor to be at the KTH school, which is a great building and a great school. We realize from the invitation that we are kindly addressed, that it would be useful to talk about our research project developed at the Faculty of Architecture of the University of Porto. Thus, we propose to divide this moment in 2 parts. The first is related to the structure of the project, and second, related to the production of social housing in Portugal. If you allow us, I will talk about the first topic and Raquel about the second. So I will give a quickly presentation about the project. This presentation is supported by the research project Mapping Public Housing, a critical review of the state subsidized residential architecture in Portugal between 1910 and 1974. Initials MDH. Okay. The team is composed by a principal investigator that whose name is Rui Ramos. Unfortunately, he can be with us today. By myself, I am the coordinator of the project, and Raquel, who is part of the team with an important role. And also I may refer some scholarship, external research. Firstly, Carmen Espegel from the Madrid, Daniel Movilla, also Fernando Rolo is a Portuguese researcher, and we had as consultants, as external consultants, Mark Swanarten from the Liverpool faculty, Monique Eleve, and also Jean-Michel Léger from Paris Belleville. So I go to talk about the main objectives of the research project. The aim of the project is to identify the public programs and their spatial concretization, neighborhoods, collective buildings, or single-family houses. In order to establish a processual, contextual, comparative, and interpretative study, it was intended to analyze the documental archives of the entities of promotion and the tutelage of public housing in Portugal. This approach enables the setting of a narrative with several purposes. First, establishing a relation between public housing programs and political and legal contexts. Second, identifying construction systems and housing types. Third, understanding social policies. Fourth, geo-referencing urban contexts in which these initiatives are inscribed. This project relies on the achievements brought up by former sector studies, both in social and in the architectural perspective, seeking mostly the articulation of knowledge and the supplementing of lacking periods, areas, or programs towards a global and systematic overview. There are some questions in the air. How many states were created in this period? How many houses? Where are they located? How did they determine the growth of the cities? Who lived there and who lives there? Of what kind of city are we talking about when we mention housing states or neighborhoods? These and many other questions might now start to find their answers after decades of omitting their social, economical, political, territorial, and architectural relevance. Using the building contexts as a starting point, the MDH research project crosses an analytical method, the database, with a reflexive process, establishing common grounds between architecture, urban design, sociology, anthropology, and other fields. The mapping public housing database under permanent construction will be available for this line of questioning and for other lines that the future might bring. You have I will link to the site of the research. The project have several outcomes. A congress, 2 books, several booklets, and a glossary, also a commentary, and also an exhibition. I only focus on the database, okay? The registry of information is divided into parts. One open to the public, that's the site. We have other with some kind of permissions that have more consistent information. So this second, it's a large internal set of data which results from research carried out in various national archives to be available later. This survey is not only to be useful for research purposes, but also for future interventions in housing heritage and discussion of new projects, informing not only architects and town planners, but also engineers, contractors, developers, and present or future inhabitants. A total of 828 neighborhoods were mapped. 547 of those 828 neighborhoods are case studies of our research project, and each of these neighborhoods is organized into 24 different programs, state programs, that were identified by the team. The collection and systematization of information allows to bring the idea of program, which is very important in the Portuguese context, of Portuguese housing history, which includes a political strategy and consequently the definition of policies for joint action with its narratives, architectural, urban, social, political, and financial, until now ignored or badly appreciated. I will travel in our database. This is a neighborhood in Condomínios, which is Oporto. You can find analytical data and quantitative data. You can go to the project drawings and another kind of documents. This is one tag, but you have another tags. You can also go to graphics, which synthesize some kind of information. So it's a very versatile database. Okay. Okay. So after this brief presentation of the MDH research project, I will give the floor to Raquel, who will talk a little about what was the production of affordable housing in Portugal between the monarchy and the revolution, which is in 1954, and what are today some of the problems of urban segregation. So, Raquel.
As I was telling you, our presentation will show some difficulties, namely in the perception of an extensive phenomenon with different political intensity, which, when not correctly observed in a global way also, produce misconceptions in the most diverse narratives, namely in the reading of the 20th century Portuguese architecture. It should also be highlighted that this research culminates in a decade of studies on this subject, on which this presentation is in depth, and we must thank all the researchers that have worked with us in the project. Given the nature and depth of this research, in this short presentation we will be cautious and will not attempt to sum it up, because there is no simple formula to explain a long and complex phenomena that have crossed diverse political systems in Portugal, from the monarchy to the long machine of the dictatorship that was named Estado Novo. This story is made up of time-prolonging process that most of the times turn cross, is divided and changes into sometimes subtle, precise or ambiguous hierarchical branches of action, into variable partnerships between the private, the financial, the philanthropic, municipal and central state. Any effort to make a synthesis must always consider that the social, geographical, economic, technic or and ultimately architectural dimensions are always faces of a single policy. We must be aware that looking at the architectural production developed around the housing programs also implies accepting a praxis in the circumstance of its time and as a part of a process which sometimes led to their own deadlock. In other words, one cannot forget that at the time Portugal was under a totalitarian regime. One must also highlight the extreme caution that is needed in the reading of the sources of information, since they were never away from the process of propaganda and struggles for power. This presentation is organized into 4 parts. A first part which deals with the passage of the 19th century to the 20th century, a second one from the First Republic to the military dictatorship, a third part which deals with the establishment of a political regime called, as I said before, Estado Novo, and a fourth part focused on the post-war developments. Finally, we will end this presentation, I don't know, maybe I will skip this part, with a position that we intend to let open to new findings that might lead to different possible perspectives and narratives. To give an example, one of these perspectives corresponds to the current segregation problem that the original inhabitants of these neighborhoods suffer in the context of increased tourism, especially in the large urban centers of Lisbon and Porto. This slide is just to show you I will not attempt to explain. I'm trying to do it with the presentation, but to let you understand the complexity of this period of time. We are not going to talk about Karl Marx and Engels' city, but we can only mention that the housing problem is related to the profound transformation and urban growth, and also the degrading conditions in which the working class lived at the end of the 19th century. The city was no longer a space for the elite to inhabit. The new city was confronted with the population that inhabited it. The city was in a transformation process, creating space for a new equipment and public spaces, where the train arrived in the inner city with hundreds of workers, and she became industrial. For example, Porto, at the turn of the century, reached a high level of industrialization. The impact on the city was, among others, a significant increase of the working class population without a corresponding physical expansion. Faced with the problem of housing deficit, the local authorities and the state were unable, in fact, to provide healthy and affordable houses to those coming to the city, mostly from the countryside. The demographic expansion resulted inevitably in a densification of its center, with particular focus on the proximity of the industries, either through the over-occupation of existing buildings that were divided in and rented by floor or by room, becoming the so-called human hives. Either by constructing a new typology of minimal housing, if we can call it so, the island, provided by the depth of the city plots in a crown that surrounded the center. The proliferation of the so-called islands, a kind of slum in the inner courtyards, reflected a process of overcrowding and environmental decay of the poor classes, living conditions, and the opportunistic view of small investors who divided and built as much as it was physically possible the property they owned in areas that had been peripheral to the city and were by then part of the urban center. In fact, wealth and poverty had their own geographies within the urban context, and the islands particularly represented ghettos installed inside bourgeois housing areas directly related to the onset of epidemics and rebel political groups. Healthiness, social hygiene, epidemics have become part of everyday life, but also social control policies. The solution to the problem required finding solutions for housing the working population in the city of Porto, for instance. We bring the case of Porto in particular. It is in the context that the scientification of city arises, with the negotiation between the private and the social, with its reformist actors, doctors, criminologists, and hygienists, sanitary engineers, architects and decorators, jurists, economists and sociologists, social workers and psychologists, among others. And it is then that the first experience of housing production will happen, with a diverse technical apparatus to combat, or try at least, the unhealthy city and its main cause, the miserable workers' housing conditions. These are movements that emerged throughout Europe with their social utopias, housing models, and urban transformation. At the same time that the nation states are created, or which Portugal, as we know, was an exception, with the appreciation of traditions, homeland and race histories that mark the emergence of eugenics. It is also at this moment that the dialectic between the collectivist model and the individualization of dueling will be established for the first time. And this passage from collective to individual will gain architectural importance, especially for those architects who graduated from technical schools, because the Beaux-Arts were concerned with other things. In this context, experience of importing models took place. Like, for example, in the slide, the fourth faces houses. This was a study that a master student that was integrated in the project developed. And she mapped these four faces houses in the city that exists in Portugal. It was then a matter of designing an economical, healthy and comfortable home, which were the founding disciplinary problems of modernity. But at the same time, we see private enterprise moving forward with low-cost housing solutions for workers, based on repetition and constructive systematization and some technological innovation. Such initiatives are parallel to the emergence of house regulation with the determination of minimum areas, ventilation and sunshine requirements, or with new concepts of privacy and personal hygiene, which introduced a notion of nuclear family. Such initiatives go hand by hand with regulation of the house, but it soon appears that philanthropy and the liberal model could not solve the colossal homelessness for the disadvantaged classes that supported industrial development and contaminated the city with their tuguria. In Portugal, with the First Republic and then with military dictatorship, it became unavoidable that the housing problem was a matter of state. There were processes of philanthropy, industrial paternalism and private enterprise to build popular housing. But in fact, they will be very few experienced and clearly insufficient to solve the problems in the city. In Portugal, the state is forced to act decisively in the 1918, with the famous 4,137 decree of 25 of April, created by Sidónio Pais, which it has been established the designation of Affordable Houses Program, with the intention of supporting the construction of 3 neighborhoods located in the main cities, Lisboa and Porto, and also a small city, Viana do Castelo, in the north of Portugal. Later, and in a more structured way, in 1919, with the 5,443 decree created by the Ministry of Labour, another 5 social neighborhoods are proposed. In fact, it has been an initiative with little success, since 3 years after its creation, in 1922, it has been suspended, and in 1925 abandoned. The state action was directed towards concentrating the public purse in the effort to complete in Lisbon at least one of the neighborhoods, Arco do Cerco, and also another one, Ajuda Boa Hora, Affordable Houses Neighborhood, launched by the previous initiative. In 1926, with military dictatorship, a new strategy of action was attempted. This new strategy aimed to articulate different institutions with the municipalities and also with private sector, appealing to new generation of technicians to look for the development of a cheap house model. In 1928, the 16,550 decree created by the Ministry of Commerce launched the Affordable Houses Program and still inherits the initiatives to finish, especially the 2 neighbors that I have already mentioned. From the legal framework created, it is important to retain a specific and significant change. From 1932, it is considered that the regime of lease or resolutable ownership of housing is intended primarily for civil and military workers. That is, housing ceased to be though for the needy, and it is now directed to those who support the regime. Okay? If this set of buildings made some urban improvements possible and even created jobs, they are first and foremost a sign of the future model of political organization of society advocated by the state, in which, along with other organizations such as the 1939 National Union State Program housing is an essential instrument of social control. It is important to emphasize that the political periodization of 1926 cannot, from a cultural point of view, separate a continuity that can only be perceived as a whole. That means it has cultural roots. Many of the concepts, ideas and forms that Estado Novo implemented came from far behind, from the monarchy and the republic. This is often forgotten, genealogy and this rooting. The Estado Novo is given an ideological intentionality in its insistence on single housing, but after all, it is just a reflection, conservative, yes, ruralist and pastoral, of course, but in continuity. In 1933, we found a sign of this. Despite the typological misconception, contrary to the single house defended by the regime, we found that Ajuda Boa Hora neighborhood will be part of the first housing program newly created by the regime, Estado Novo, the Affordable Housing Program, with the Affordable Housing Program. The neighborhood was inaugurated as a masterpiece of Portuguese architecture in 1934 by personalities of the state, and I must refer the dictatorship mentor Oliveira Salazar was in this moment. The same happens with Arco do Cerco neighborhoods, open a little bit later. Symptomatically, the neighborhoods began being built in the period of Portuguese Republic and were later finished and inaugurated by the regime, by Salazar, during the Estado Novo political frame. These neighborhoods served as a vehicle for significant propaganda of the success of the emerging regime, and in particular of Salazar's central idea that the house was the pillar of an unchanging national identity that he wished to characterize, that characterized his political action. In the research about programmed housing intervened by the state after 1933, we firstly see a vertical hierarchization of the entire bureaucratic structure of designing, building, and delivering housing. This process culminates in the presidency of the Chancellor, that is, in Oliveira Salazar, through the centralization of all steps of this action in the Undersecretariat of State. This body depended on the tutelage also has the National Institute of Labour and Welfare that managed the long chain of the process of building house from negotiation with municipalities to the delivery of houses. There is no doubt about the importance of state programmed housing as an instrument at the service of a corporate policy. Perhaps one should remember that it was ultimately intended by a corporate policy, namely the alleged annulment of class difference and consequently class struggle, since all had to contribute to the so-called national interests. Thus, it is intended to be mystified that employers, workers, intellectuals, and artists were together in building a politics of the spirit. But if the pyramid hierarchization of the system was one of its evidences, the internal dispute for power and forms of action with consequences on the bureaucratic dispersion among various organisms will have direct echoes in the organization of housing programs, being the most evident case the structural dichotomy within the Ministry of Public Works and Communications, which was responsible for services with different technical views and political directions, namely in housing intervention. On the one hand, in the general dictatorate of national buildings and monuments, and in the services of the affordable housings, there was an idea of a rural and nationalist Portugal dear to Salazar the dictator. On the other hand, from 1945 to the general I don't know if it's the time? Okay. The General Directorate of Urbanization Services opposed the individual house as a technical and economic solution to meet housing needs. With the end of the Second World War, these different visions will be confronted. They must be understood as reflecting the transformations of conditions, whether external from 1945 or internal to governance, which had other understandings of the goals and ways to achieve national progress and, in this case, how to address the problem of housing. In these post-war years, the Portuguese underdevelopment and its failing economy model were hardly concealable. The new generation of engineers presented a technocratic vision of great economic pragmatism that was not comparable with a ruralist and anti-cosmopolitan policy. In housing, it became clear that the construction of single houses, besides being expensive and a slow process, was ineffective in solving the homelessness of the poor and the image of poverty that was raging throughout the country. In this context, it began the revision of the housing policy for a broader social reach for a new middle class with the introduction of crucial changes. The new 2007 law of the 1945, which defines the affordable rent house program, now provides for the lease regime, overcoming the issue of resolvable property implemented in the 1930s by the economic houses and frees the construction of the typological bound of the single-family house, enabling the construction of collective housing buildings without limitation on the number of floors. It is curious to note that this new program will be careful not to put into question ostensibly the previous housing model of affordable houses program, thus avoiding questioning one of the pillars of the regime and its mitigation, which will remain in parallel with affordable rent houses program and with other until 1972. It is the coexistence between single-family houses and collective houses in a dialectic of models of society that ensure family autonomy anchored in values of rurality and the massification of housing centered on urban community values in a game that mixes ideology with the pragmatism of city building. This hesitation between housing for some or housing for the greatest number will remain in the Ministry of Public Works and Communication bicefal organization, both in political orientation and architectural intervention. It should be noted that, on the one hand, the General Directorate of Urbanization Service will focus on housing for disadvantaged classes, with the houses for the poor families and the houses for fishermen that we want to address in this presentation. On the other hand, the Undersecretariat of State of Corporations and Social Welfare will concentrate with the possibilities of applying to new affordable rent house program in response to the emerging middle class. To this end, it will claim the Affordable Housing Federation of Pension Funds, from which it will provide at the same time the need for a possibility of internationally informed modern response to housing problems. With the release of funds from the pension funds and the possibility to use them in housing construction, and also with the publication of new lease law in 1945, the conditions were met for a new view of the social housing problem, which will pass by the determining figure of the first director of the Affordable Housing Federal of Pension Funds from 1948, the architect Nuno Teotónio Pereira. With the Affordable Rent Houses program and its implementation by the Affordable Housing Federation of Pension Funds, a modern housing architecture will be driven by the realistic vision of Nuno Teotónio Pereira, who will not only call young architects to design housing across the country, but will bring new concerns to the designing process. such as the adequacy of the neighborhoods to the place of establishment, conducting surveys to the inhabitants about social issues that should inform the design of the house, or the proposal of new working methodologies and informing sharing in network through the designated type functional elements of the starting point project. With the Affordable Housing Federation pension funds, several neighborhoods of the affordable rent houses were built, namely the Sodapova neighborhood in 1953 by Nuno António Pereira, the Parede grouping built in 1957 by the hand of Rui Atouguia, Santa Marta neighborhood in 1958, also by Teotónio Pereira, Pedreiras neighborhood in 1958, designed by Nuno Teotónio Pereira and Nuno Portas, and several others, just to give you an example. Or the private support program for the houses with controlled rent programs. It shouldn't be this image, sorry. Okay, this was the examples I was telling you about, the different neighborhoods. And now the correct one. Or the private support program for houses with controlled rent program, created in 1847 but soon extinguished in 1967 due to alleged irregularities in the financed works. This program allowed the construction of an exceptional neighborhood called Bairro das Estacas, designed by Rui Atouguia and Formosinho Sanchez in 1949. These neighborhoods that I have been showing to you are some of the greatest examples of modern architecture in Portugal, of innovation in housing design, and of the change in programmed housing policy, which reveals itself simultaneously with the experimentation that was taking place in the international context. I'm almost okay. Much remains to be said about these programs and sub-programs. Between 1910 and 1974, the scale of public intervention can be understood as low, but with remarkable stability in launching public housing programs. They are increasing after Second World War. I'm trying to sum it all this period that I was showing you. They increase after Second World War, which gives rise within a frame of general change of society to a shift from traditional construction to an industrial one with significant job creation. An aspect it is not limited to programmed housing and that has consequences on the shape of the city, the growth of peripheries, and on real estate speculation. This passage will allow the full introduction in Portugal of modern architecture into large-scale programs. Ruptures will be avoided and a logic of continuity with the past of Portuguese architecture will prevail. As a consequence, modern architectural production is characterized by being impure, polyphonic, and procedural. The 1960s saw an apparent reduction in housing investment. These are the years in which the foundations of post-25 of April housing policies are being laid. Once again, we are speaking about continuities. We should note that in 1964, for the first time, the planning instruments introduced housing as an important issue to address, just this time. It will appear in the Portuguese Interim Development Plan. Furthermore, in the 1969, an important housing policy colloquium was held. This colloquium was of major importance. The right to citizenship associated with housing was strengthened. Furthermore, it has been stated that housing was a right that had to be guaranteed to all by the community and at the responsibility of the state. It was evident that the need to counterattack the dispersion of state action, shifting towards a concentration of competence and assignments. 1 month before but close related with the colloquium, we must refer the creation of the Housing Promotion Fund that would allow the state to centralize the activities around housing promotion and would be responsible for leading an important administrative reform. The passage to democratic regime reveals the limitation of the Estado Novo policy of housing. The situation was dramatic. In 1974, in 2.5 million houses, 52% had no water supply, 53% had no electricity, 60% had no sewage, 67% had no toilet facilities, and 600,000 houses were still missing. Looking at the distribution by programs, we can conclude that the regime has hesitated about the priorities. Between the program of affordable houses and later the affordable rent houses program and the merciful position of the House for the Poor Family program, there are the advances and the setbacks of political elites as to who should be the focus of the housing policy. Thus, three types of state policy can be recognized: resolvable property-based programs focused on creating a property class like affordable houses program, lease and take-back programs based on households with above average income associated with provident funds or intended to build their own home, such as the affordable rent houses program, and the precarious lease programs for lower income state-dependent households to access housing with minimum of living conditions like the House for the Poor program. In the late 1950s, a distinct action was observed. The partnership established between the two large municipalities of the country and the Ministry of Public Works, which led to intensive and rapid results interventions with the Porto Improvement Plans and Lisbon City New Construction Plan, to, within a few years, reach the same size as the various programs already mentioned and which are spread over several decades. The Estado Novo action was hesitant and relatively small in size. However, it cannot be denied the political burden of importance, both in terms of social condition and social control, ascribed by the dictatorship to housing. All of this process ends up with the Portuguese Revolution in 25 April 1974, with the implementation of democracy and the creation of a new program, SAL, Local Ambulatory Support Service, that lasts just 2 years but was revolutionary and had a major impact, as we were about to explain. SAL found a happy and unique opportunity with a population that, since their expulsion from central areas of the city, was mobilized, relatively organized, and aware of their needs and aspirations. Okay, I should. We had organized a last part that I'm not going to explain you, just to show the different processes that happen in these neighborhoods, meaning those for middle-class families and also in the islands that were not extinguished. They exist today, and because tourism has reached to a higher point, now we are in a process of gentrification and also touristification of the city, namely in Porto. And I was about to explain this process, but maybe we can talk about it if there's time. Okay, thank you. Okay.